Let's be joined by the one and only, remember her name, my colleague from the United States, Rachel Blevins. Rachel, welcome back. It's wonderful, as always, to see you. Well, by this time next week, your country might be at war with Russia, and we might be looking at an all-out war on the European continent. Do the American people know that?
Yeah, I think they look at it and they realize the fact that this is a region of the world that isn't close to theirs, and they've decided in many ways not to care about it. And it's interesting to see how so much of the media coverage of this situation, of course, it's no surprise that it has been beating those war drums, calling for an increase in conflict, but at the same time leaving out the facts surrounding the situation. You know, we look at the fact that just a few weeks ago, it was Russia presenting a security pact, calling for a decrease in escalations, calling for an agreement with the US and with NATO. And the United States' response to that was to say, no, we don't want to be controlled by NATO. And instead, what we've seen is we've seen the Biden administration ramping up this rhetoric. We saw, just this week, the fact that, the Biden administration shipped over 200,000 pounds of, I guess, what they are now referring to as lethal aid over to
Sounds
Ukraine.
lovely, doesn't it? Lethal aid.
Right.
This is almost an oxymoron.
Exactly. It's like the buzzword of the moment. And of course, this is something that was signed off on previously by the Biden administration. But then at the same time, when we had this story that came out from the UK claiming that they knew of a plot from Russia to invade Ukraine and to take over their government and overthrow their leaders, the US hasn't even really questioned that. They've just kind of nodded along and been like, yep, that goes with exactly what we've been saying.
It's a new Steele dossier. We'll probably find that Steele wrote it.
At this point, yeah. And it was funny because it's bad when even The Guardian, when they were reporting on this, actually had to admit that there were hardly any details in this report of exactly how Russia was supposed to carry out this government overthrow. Like, they actually had to admit that. Therefore, that it is a rough situation, not to mention the fact that we've got the UK out here claiming that Russia's quote unquote pro-Russian former Ukrainian politicians they want to be in power are people who are actually sanctioned by Russia. I mean, if you really take the time to look at the facts of this, it makes no sense at all. However, when the US media takes it, what they do with it is they, just kind of breeze over those facts and instead look at the headline, which they know will grab viewer attention. And instead they just tell you, well, see, we've got another country telling you that Russia's planning to invade and overthrow. And therefore, the US needs to get even more involved in yet another conflict.
Well, this is what troubles me most, Rachel. The lying liars are lying again. Through the same mouthpieces, the same television stations, the same newspapers, oftentimes this very same commentators. The people that said we must invade Iraq because it has weapons of mass destruction. The people who said Gaddafi had given his army Viagra and sent them out on a campaign of mass rape. The same people who told us that Syria and the world would be better off if Al-Qaeda and ISIS were in control of Damascus, on the Mediterranean, in Syria. The same people who've lied over and over again and who are widely regarded as liars by their own people on a day-to-day basis. Most people in America think their government is lying to them. Most people in Britain think their government is habitually lying to them. But when it comes to these big international issues of war and peace, it seems that when the drums start beating, everyone falls into line again.
Yeah, you were exactly right. And on top of that, the majority of Americans also don't trust the media. And we see survey after survey of people who say that, the trust in the media has come to a historic low. And yet at the same time, when you've got those mainstream media talking heads sitting there telling you, hey, Russia's about to invade, we have to step in and fight for the freedoms of the Ukrainian people, whether they want that quote unquote help or not, all of a sudden the American people think, oh, okay, we need to trust our politicians and our media once again and hop on board. I mean, it makes no sense. And it also comes back around to the fact that, 20 years after the so-called war on terror, as we've seen, as you predicted, it was an absolute failure. And the cost of that war was so incredibly high, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of civilian casualties, in terms of how much this country wasted to go and to destroy other countries on the other side of the world. And it makes no sense to me that we're now sitting here looking at a direct confrontation with Russia and actually debating as to whether or not that's something that the United States should be considering, while at the same time we also have to remember that Russia is not the country that is provoking this escalation here. Russia is the country that has consistently sat there and said, not only do we not have plans to invade, but please show us what you think that we have planned. Show us the information that you are citing when you come forward and you say these U.S. intelligence officials claim that there's going to be some kind of invasion. For as long as we have that, for as long as we have a country that is sitting there and saying, look, we don't want a war in our backyard, that's something that the American people should be paying attention to, because it brings us back to the fact that the United States is on the exact same war path, except this time around they're going up against a nuclear power, and in that kind of situation, no one wins.
Well, quite. The tropes roll out, and I know that they hit home because a close friend of mine used their language to me just the other day. Russia is massing 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, he said. But the Ukrainians have massed 125,000 forces on the Russian border. But nobody ever uses that figure. There are more Ukrainian soldiers on the Russian border than there are Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian border. But you repeat these war tropes and they definitely hit the mark. I now know that from my survey of social media and the rest, that there are people who are asking me the same questions that they asked about Iraq before the war. Well, what should we do about Saddam Hussein? What should we do about Vladimir Putin, about Russia, about Ukraine, and so on? First of all, if you do anything, you will lose. But the entire world may be enveloped in a nuclear confrontation. Because, look, of course, there'll be no immediate use of nuclear weapons. But if, say, my thesis, the Ukrainians invade the autonomous republics and begin slaughtering Russian nationals and Russian citizens, then Russia will undoubtedly enter the country. Then there'll be a war between Russia and a part of the Ukraine. Who's going to say, with their hand on their heart, that that will not spread to the neighboring countries? Who's going to say that China will not take advantage of that situation to take action in the Straits of Taiwan? Who's therefore going to say that this will not all spiral into an all-enveloping war? Are people just going to sleepwalk into that? In our country, yes. I'm presuming in your country also.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's a really good point to talk about sort of that domino effect that we're facing here. And I also think it's important to talk about what if this situation were flipped around, because it's interesting how people always want to talk about Russian troops on Ukraine's border, yet they don't want to talk about the fact that these are troops in Russia. They also don't want to talk about the fact that if this situation were reversed, and let's say that Russia had poured $2.7 billion worth of quote unquote lethal aid into Canada, and we saw troops lining up on the US northern border, you know that the United States would be worried about it. I mean, to sit there, then we could have that conversation and say, well, what should we do? Because it would be something involving our country. But this idea that the United States needs to continue to assert itself all around the world, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Taiwan, and needs to, really go up against these other larger countries. I mean, I don't think that the average citizen, especially here in the United States, realizes the cost that could come with that, or realizes the fact that, yeah, we can sit here all day long and talk about how the United States has the largest military budget in the world and the most advanced military, but that doesn't mean that we should be going up against a country like Russia, like China, or like the two of them combined, because at the end of the day, those politicians will sit there and they will call for that conflict, but it's not their sons and daughters who are going off to fight and to die in that war. And that's something that I really hope that people will grasp, at least before it's too late.
Now, the elephant sitting in the room, or the donkey sitting in the room, is Joe Biden. He's had a very bad week. I follow, like you do, the clips of him speaking, his press conferences, and so on. He's really reaching a stage which must be medically critical. He is incapable of carrying out his role as the commander-in-chief. If I'm right about that, who is calling the shots? Who is the commander-in-chief? Who is making these decisions? I don't believe that it's Joe Biden anymore.
Yeah, I don't believe it either, especially when you look at the fact that, this last week he was able to have a press conference. It was a good reminder of why they typically don't let him have press conferences, because he sat there and he admitted that, at least from his standpoint, he referred to it as a minor incursion, which is to say that, look, if Russia goes into Ukraine in some way, or even into some of these autonomous regions that Ukraine claims as its own, then the United States would not necessarily come in and declare World War III. Now, to you or I, that may seem like it's common sense for the U.S. to hold back a little bit from going towards World War III. However, what immediately transpired after that was that the White House and every other member of the Biden administration was working overtime to come back and say, no, Biden didn't really mean that. What he actually meant was that the U.S. fully supports Ukraine and there will be swift and severe consequences if Russia does anything. We've seen Blinken now back that up. And so I think when you're looking at Biden, it's clear in those moments that he's not calling the shots. And it does make you wonder, if not, then who is calling the shots? Who is sitting there directing his entire administration to then come back and play catch up and try to say, well, he didn't really mean what he said. And oh, by the way, he's not allowed to have press conferences anymore.
Well, the United States fought most of the Second World War when it joined under Roosevelt, who was physically handicapped, but his mind was crystal clear, and a very great wartime president he turned out to be. But here you might be going into a war with a man who is not physically handicapped, but is mentally degraded to the point that it must be a clear and present danger to the Republic that at the bottom of his bed is the nuclear football. I don't understand why more people in the media, in the political class, are not actually calling that situation out in the US.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. And especially when you look at the fact that, okay, if Joe Biden can't handle it, then you have someone like Kamala Harris who can't seem to get through a single interview, let alone, I don't really want to know what she would do when it comes to a situation like that in terms of foreign policy, because she would be in one of those places of trying to prove herself and trying to prove that she could take on a country like Russia, and she would fail miserably as a result. Behind her, you've got Nancy Pelosi, who looks like she's 110 years old and has been in Congress for decades upon decades. I mean, the U.S. really isn't doing too hot in terms of this.
She's better before lunchtime, as we say here. Rachel, thanks. I'm so grateful to you. Thanks for your time again on the mother of all talk shows.